Scott Robohn is the founder of Tech Salescraft, co-founder and managing director of Network Automation Forum, and has a storied past in leadership with telecommunications companies like Cisco, Juniper, and Nokia. In this conversation, we discuss what's next after Autocon 0, the power of culture, learnings from the past, and Scott's story of transitioning from the big vendor world to independent consulting.
Welcome to the show, Scott. How's it going?
Really good, William. How about you?
Really good. It's nice to be doing this in person.
That's right. We are in the same physical room, so
Yes.
Very good.
Yeah. So how are things going?
Pretty good. We're dealing with some snow here in Northern Virginia right now in January 24, and it's not bad. We're digging out.
Right on. So I heard you on a ton of podcasts leading up to Network Automation Forum's Autocon 0, and now it's over. It's done. What were your impressions? How did it go?
Well, I would say it's only just begun. We couldn't be more pleased with how the Denver 2023 event went. We have lots of things we want to do in addition to the regular events, but we are settling to what looks like a 2-year cadence right now, and figuring out what our priorities are going to be in addition to the in-person events.
Awesome. Yeah, I saw that. I think the call for papers for Europe. So you're giving the European folks a little bit of love.
For sure. So after the Denver event, Chris Grundeman and I kind of went our separate ways and got a little downtime. And we said, we'll compare our priority lists when we come back. And the number one item on each of our individual lists was a European event. There were a lot of folks that came for the Denver event that really, really wanted to see something happen in Europe. So we're happy to accommodate.
Yeah, that's awesome. Good to hear. When is what are the dates for Europe?
So we are targeting the last full week of May, the week of May 27th. I realize that's Memorial Day in the US. That's not a problem in Europe. So for those of you who want to travel, happy to have you over there. Probably will be the Wednesday, Thursday, Friday of that week. And what we plan to do is do half day, then a full day, then a half day. And we are working on some other supplementary activities that may happen on Monday and Tuesday in terms of training. Stand by. We'll share more details when that's available.
Awesome. Yeah, that's exciting. And I got to say, it was one of the most exciting events I've ever been to. There was so much excitement, so much energy, and everybody was there for really a lot of the same reasons.
Yeah.
Which is great.
Yep.
And that's how these hallway conversations that you have at events like that, they're just awesome.
Hallway track, right?
Yeah,
That's
it.
critical. What top one or two things did you take away from it if you had to narrow it down?
So when before I came, I thought I had an idea of what sort of if you think of just your normal traditional network engineer, what they were going to think sort of the holdups were, what
Sure.
they were going to think was holding everything back. And, one thing I realized is most folks are actually on the same page. There's a lot of culture. There's a lot of tooling things. There's a lot more that the vendors can do, but culture, for me, was at the top of the mountain. That's the thing. You've got to figure out culture before you're going to get, maybe you can do 5%. Maybe you can do some small things here and there.
Right.
But in order to make it an enterprise-wide change, you have to start with culture. Yeah.
It's so my eyes were kind of open to that when Terry Slattery, who is really well known in our circles, kind of came back, and when he heard some of our initial podcasts promoting Autocon 0, he reached out and said, you're asking questions and I don't think you're answering them. I don't think you've answered the reasons for why network automation isn't really seeing accelerated adoption. And his first response, I think he had a 4-point response, but culture was at the top of his list. And that really got me thinking about that before we actually ended up in Denver.
Yeah. Yeah. And having come from the enterprise side myself for 15 years, you can be a part of a part of your organization, part of your team, and, maybe your team, a few people take on some task to try to do a thing. But culture, if you think about it, like one of the companies I worked for, like you had to put in a ticket and go through change control to actually get a Git repository created on our internal Git repo.
Wow.
Or our internal platform. So everything, and then the guardrails around that Git repo, all these things, that's a big culture shift because a lot of folks are just used to going to GitHub, creating a Git repo, and committing to main, and not doing branching, not doing anything that goes along with the best practices of automation. But getting those things wrapped up in the culture, and you've got to get in the turn as well with some of these new tools. It's a challenge for sure.
So on the culture front in particular, and we can park here if we want to. If it's not interesting to you, we can move on from it. I think there are some really interesting reasons why we have the culture we do in network engineering in particular. And to call out the gray hairs in my beard, I came into this in the early 90s, before commercial internet expansion really took off, and it was industrial strength networking, even if it was only T1s at the time. But there was a real, if you could you could perform well in a network engineering role. Pedigree didn't matter, formal education didn't matter. And there was, for lack of a better way of putting it, a lot of cowboy type mentality. Let's just get this done. And on one hand, that's very powerful. On the other hand, it really flies against process, right? Nobody, who wants to open a ticket to get a Git repo, right? Well, there might be better reasons for having an established process that looks at flow end to end. And just to betray some of the stuff I've been doing the past couple months, I'm doing a lot of reading on manufacturing statistical process control principles and how they can be applied in a network engineering context in particular.
That sounds interesting.
Yeah, it was kind of challenged by John Willis at AutoCon Zero, who talked about this quality control guru, W. Edwards Deming, and how a lot of his work fed right into DevOps principles. And I'm trying to say, what does direct application look like without going through the DevOps node, if you will?
Yeah, it's funny because like the whole DevOps paradigm, and I remember when DevOps was first this thing and cloud was just eating everything up, and the whole thing of I think moving fast was the basis of like the coolness of DevOps in the beginning. We've got to be agile. We've got to move fast. We've got to break down the barriers, all these, buzzwords. But it's funny because there's a paradigm that we've dealt with forever. It's, centralized and decentralized.
Right.
So one of the things that's important with a big company is being efficient with how decisions are made. Right. If you can't be efficient with how your decisions are made, you're going to have it's an uphill battle,
right,
all the way. So with this whole DevOps thing, it's like, okay, centralized, decentralized. Do we have decentralized teams? They build it and then they own it.
Yep.
Or is there some sort of cloud center of excellence that is like these CCOEs have really taken over as like the new enterprise architecture type thing? Right. So how do you do that? Because most big companies, they can't just decentralize and say, oh, this team, they built it, they support it across, one company I worked for had over like 1,000 applications.
Yeah.
Like, how are you going to do that? That's madness. You've got to have some sort of centralized functions there to do things, governance, oversight, especially if you're dealing with like protected information.
It matters, right? And, in networking, we have a principle for this, switch where you can, route where you must, right? So, sorry, that's a misapplication of the principle, but, it kind of works here, right? I've always been a fan of what I call lightweight process. You need processes to help keep people coordinated, but don't make the processes more onerous or heavy than they have to be. That's not always obvious how you do that, but that takes some thought and some, elevated view versus I got to troubleshoot this Ethernet port. I've got to figure out why this BGP peering keeps flapping and so forth.
Yeah, it's funny. I don't know. It was one of the big tech CEOs. I don't remember who, but basically was venting. It was probably Elon Musk on Twitter, or not Twitter, X. I don't remember, but basically he was basically saying you have to, when you're the reason, I think he was like venting about like maybe government or something, like you have all these processes that have been built up over time and they don't get revisited. Like you never go back. Like, are they relevant? So we have all these stacks and stacks and stacks of process.
Right.
You're never revisiting it. You're just adding more process to handle the processes. And it's just abundantly clear that at some point, if you really want to get back to being efficient again, you have to go back and revisit these things and delete the things that aren't pertinent anymore, which is challenging.
So I'm right in the middle of the Walter Isaacson Musk biography right now.
I read that one too.
So it's, say what you want about Mr. Musk. It is really fascinating. And to your point on requirements, he did this at Tesla, he did this at SpaceX. If there isn't a name attached to a requirement, delete it.
Yeah.
Every requirement has to have an individual name associated with it. And he also, I think, likes the principle of how do I say this concisely? Be ruthless in deleting things. And if you don't have to go back and add 10% back,
that's what it was. Yeah.
You're not deleting enough, which I think there's a really interesting principle there. Again, you got to be careful about blanket application, but that's clearly part of his mindset.
Yeah. Yeah. I read the Steve Jobs, and then the Da Vinci one as well.
Right.
He's a great author.
I totally agree.
And it's motivating, but it's also because the Steve Jobs one was interesting because before I read that, I knew folks typically said that Steve Jobs is kind of hard to work for and work with. And I didn't understand that until I read that book. I was like, wow, oh boy. He would have been a difficult boss to have.
So that was the first Isaacson book I ever read, the Jobs bio. And I was sold on Isaacson as a writer. He's very accessible, just so easy to read. And I looked at the Jobs bio as a case study in how not to be a leader. There's the big question, right? Do you have to be a personality like Jobs, like Musk, like others to do big things? And my answer to that would be, well, that's one way to do big things. I don't think it's the only way.
Agreed. Yeah. The people, I mean, being good to people, being, not being, disingenuous, not firing people on the spot, maybe like some of those things that were, was pretty common with some of these leaders. Do you have to do that? Maybe not. I don't know. It's just one of those things. I mean, so not to switch topics completely, but one thing so AutoCon, as Zero has come and gone.
Yep.
So I did a mini panel and it was fun. And, we talked a little bit about something different. We talked a little bit about cloud because cloud is really, for better, for worse, has really shaped automation as a discipline for first of all, like what is possible,
right? Like
what can be done.
Yep.
And not only what is possible, but the hyperscalers are, top to bottom, 100% automating just about everything.
Right.
And then they've built these, these clouds, Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud Platform, to provide you with this interaction surface to where you can basically automate top to bottom. And one thing, when I first started working in cloud, it was like, the DevOps and the automation was just part of the job. It was a principle. It came with the package.
Can't do stuff at scale without automation in cloud environments. Yeah, totally. Yep.
So coming into that and getting into those ecosystems and, beginning to understand them, getting into pipelines and having even like pipelines take over as your change management, building some of those things out in the past, it was really eye-opening for me. And one of the things I have to ask is, what do you see? Because there's a lot of, I'd say a lot of network engineers out there, they hear cloud and they're just like eye roll, like doom and gloom. It's, keep that away. But like, there's got to be things, cloud has done it.
Right.
So what can we learn and what can we bring back to the discipline of network engineering? Any thoughts?
That's an excellent question. So I think in general, you need principled application of how things work in cloud and how to apply it to network engineering. So there's multiple dynamics we could tease out here, but let's pick on a couple. Pets versus cattle, right? Okay, in cloud environments, generally everything's viewed as cattle, right? These instances are ephemeral. I can spin them up. I can use them. I can turn them down. That's part of the environment, right? There should be very few pets in a cloud environment. And if you've got something that's persistent, maybe you should think about that existing on a dedicated platform. Networking is kind of the photo negative, right? Most network devices exist in space and time, are not ephemeral, and are more pet-like than cattle-like. If you work in a hybrid environment, you may have VNFs spinning up in a cloud environment, small dedicated routers for certain applications. Knowing how it applies from cloud to traditional networking, that's an important distinction, right? And understand, what's pet and what's part of the herd. I think that's a good distinction. I have another one, but I'll let you respond on that first.
No, I mean, the pet versus cattle thing is it's perfect because most large enterprises are still in that pet sort of scenario. And a lot of it is my take on it. So I heard the founder of Dinesh Dutt.
Right. Yeah.
Great. He wrote a great book a while back that I picked up. But he said something once on some podcast. I can't remember. This has been several years back. But he basically said, in networking, it's so hard because just so many things can break.
Right.
He said, in the application world, they don't like a database. They just build a new one.
Right.
And they use that.
Exactly.
And in networking, that is like missing because who can just go into their production network and start messing around with things? And do they even have a lab? Right. They have extra gear. They can't mimic production.
Yeah.
There's so many different things.
Because of the limits of physics, right? You don't have the direct analog to dev test production from cloud, in traditional appliance-based networking, right? One other big thing I would pick on here too is the concern that many network engineers have about being coders, right? I'm not a coder. I don't want to be one. And it's a real thing, right? And I get it. There's been some interesting interactions on this front publicly over the last couple of weeks.
Yeah.
And my response is basically, number one, this is where Moneyball is really important. I'm not a baseball guy, but I love the movie, right? And the whole idea of don't try to craft a team with specific individuals. Craft a team with the right skills, and you need the skills somewhere on the team, right? So if you don't want to be a coder, you don't have to, right? And this is, back to our Job said must good leaders conversation. Well, this is where knowing your team matters, right? And knowing what people are capable of and what's going to really excite them and what's going to turn them off. If somebody doesn't want to be a coder, it's okay. There are ways to build skills on the team that doesn't force a mandate on everyone. That would be my first response on that. The second is, man, there's some really interesting advances in automation and orchestration tools that are leveraging low code. I won't say no code because I think it's
a lie.
Let's go with that. It's a lie. But low code making automation and orchestration more accessible to more network engineers, that's awesome, right? And we should fan that flame for tools like that to come into the market. And not to eliminate or displace Python or whatever your new pet scripting language is for writing your own scripts. There are always going to be people who want to roll their own, right? And there's always going to be a place for that. But the third point in response to that is there is an opportunity for you to upskill and learning automation skills for those who want to. there's real opportunity to take advantage of it. And that's one of the big things that we felt at AutoCon Zero. It was a pretty unified audience of people that just were hungry for what more can we do with network automation.
Great answer. And it reminds. So I have a few things to add. So I once had the privilege of building out a net DevOps team essentially, and there was going to be automation in the data centers,
right?
But also in the cloud networking area, like all the way,
right.
And so I had a decision to make, because historically, when I would do any hiring, you're basically like, okay, we manage the network. Somebody understands BGP. Yeah, we have a little OSPF over here,
right?
Some custom stuff, but okay, can they follow the packet? Do they understand routing?
Right.
And the rest of the stuff, maybe we can teach them. Well, this was a different problem because it's so many different areas and there's so many diverse skill sets. So I thought, I think I had like 5 headcount to start out with. And I'm like, okay, what do I hire for?
Right.
And so what I ended up doing, which was actually really successful, is I got one person that really understood networking very deeply. They couldn't automate anything.
Right.
Then I had one person that understood cloud really deeply.
Yep.
And then I had somebody that was like a quasi software developer. So they'd done a little bit of infrastructure, but they could write in several different languages. They were just super sharp. And then I had somebody that was who's gonna manage the Kanban board, who's gonna do all the stories and do all this stuff. So I had somebody to come in that was almost like a technical scrum master of sorts, really. And this ended up working really well. We all were skilled in a specific area, but then the problem happens to where someone goes on vacation,
right?
And you don't have that exact same skill set,
right?
Which is, there's always trade-offs, and no matter how you approach it. So,
I've always been a fan of active and standby, right? So for any skills that you have on the team, you've got a leader, right? Somebody who is the subject matter expert, and then maybe someone who's either not as experienced or is willing to be the Padawan. To the Jedi, right? Sorry, going Star Wars.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Oh, you're gonna see some Star Wars tonight. That's for sure.
Excellent. I'm ready.
I've got some fun Star Wars things in my slides for this event. So, just a little about Scott. So, you have an interesting. I think you have a really interesting background. You're really rooted in network engineering. You historically have worked for some of the big bucks. Hardware vendors, Juniper, Cisco, to name a few, and you've kind of pivoted. You're an independent consultant, but you're not just doing one thing. I think you have like 3, network automation forum, tech salescraft, and Cypress.
Correct. Cypress Consulting.
You had a lot going on. How was that transition?
So I basically started the independent route a year ago this month, and I'm absolutely loving it. I will say, for wherever you are in your career, all your experience is additive, right? And sometimes it's multiplicative. I'm so grateful for the path that I've come through. Roughly the first 15 years or so of my career were very operational. I worked for a carrier, Bell Atlantic. I was a Cisco training partner for a time. And at really just an incredible time in the industry. Landed at Juniper. I was a trainer. I was a TAC engineer for 5 years. And boy, the difference between being a trainer and being a TAC engineer. If you're a trainer, you know how things are supposed to work. In TAC, you learn how things break, and implementation matters, right? I transitioned there to move in, onto the dark side. Being a systems engineer, I say that very deliberately. Not a fan of the term sales engineer. I understand it's dominant in the market, but that's fine. And became an SE leader, and just got to do some really, really fun things with Juniper, with Cisco, with Nokia, and with DriveNets. But I always had this itch to do my own thing. And I'm sorry, my favorite story on this front, Dave Grohl, right? Drummer for Nirvana, and Foo Fighters. When Nirvana just imploded, right? A horrible, tragic story there. And he didn't want to play music for almost 9 months. He gets a call from Tom Petty, will you be our drummer on Saturday Night Live? And it energized him, right? He said, yes, I'm definitely going to do this. And then he got the offer after the Saturday Night Live gig to come be the drummer for the Heartbreakers. And he thought about it and said, I've got these songs I've been writing and recording on my own, and I think I'm going to go do this risky, dangerous thing that I've never done before. And that's how Foo Fighters was born. What I'm doing now is kind of my Foo Fighters. In no way to elevate myself or make myself equal with a musician of that skill. But this is kind of my opportunity to do something very different and be more directed, get to pick and choose what I do. And it's totally enabled me to do things like Network Automation Forum and partner with Chris Groneman to do the work that I'm doing with Cypress Consulting and Amir and Jeff Lockridge and that whole crew and other really interesting consulting projects. So I'm a very grateful individual and I'm loving it.
That's great because the one thing you don't get back, you don't get your time back. And one thing that I know, and you probably know as well, is you work for a larger company. There's a lot of red tape. There's a lot of calls. There's a lot of paperwork. There's a lot of stuff that you spend time on.
Sure.
That's not, it's kind of removed from the actual work, from the engineering, from the technology, from everything else. And I think the smaller you go in company size, and to the point where you're just on your own, the sky's the limit. What do you want to work on? Where do you want to focus? How are you going to use all your time? And it's in your hands, which is frightening, but also like very cool, at the same time.
There is an aha moment when you realize that your job is to write emails. And that's a sad moment. And that happens in large companies. I think one of my survival strategies was always to stay close to the technology. I'm wired that way. I want to know, what RSVP is doing to set up this LSP. I want to know what's happening, with these BGP and LRI, right? It's helped me be a very effective technical leader. I shouldn't say that about myself. I should let others say that if they feel that way. But staying close to the tech has always been important to me, and what I'm doing now definitely, quenches that thirst.
I agree with you 100% there. So being far removed from being in the command line, all the time, I still have a hypervisor at home. I still spin up virtual routers. I'm messing around with BGP. Whenever I'm starting to get a little rusty, I've got to get back in and do some labbing and set some things up because I don't want to lose that.
Right.
There may be a chance where I really need that in the future. And, I spend all the time to learn it and to, I don't want to say become an expert, but get proficient. I put in 10,000 hours of this stuff. So I don't just want to, hey, bye-bye. I'm in my emails. That's not cool.
Well, because this is the cloud gambit, I have to work in a cards analogy here. So I will see you might need those skills again someday, and I will raise you, and it will probably be the basis for you learning new things.
Yeah.
Right. There's things from Apple Talk that fed directly into DHCP. Yeah. Right. There is nothing new under the sun. Everything gets recycled to a certain extent.
100%. Russ White, Rule 11.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I guess, one thing that is for sure, you can take this to the bank is, the world has become hybrid. So I think in the beginning it was okay, one of the companies that I worked for sort of went on this mission in the beginning, we're just going to exit our data centers. We're going to migrate everything out and we're going to be in the cloud in X amount of months. And that generally doesn't go that way for most companies to try to do that. It becomes more of a, okay, we're excited. We have this dynamic. We're just going to get everything over there and we're not going to have data centers to, this is cloud. We got to actually build a tenancy. We have a framework. We have governance. We have all these things. We have to operationalize it. You can't just let full stack developers run free on the prairie. That'd be a disaster. So there's a lot of work involved. And then you realize, hey, do I really want to move rows of mainframes up to the cloud? Or, hey, this makes actually a lot of sense to run in my data center. I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to keep it. And the things that make sense to run in cloud, hey, we'll run them in cloud. It doesn't have to be all or nothing.
Correct.
So what As far as like technologies, as far as like I know like mobility, portability,
Yep.
like all these things that sort of tie into the hybrid cloud story. What do network practitioners, how do they get prepared? What do they need to do, or what's their role in building a network to sort of facilitate these things?
So it's a really interesting set of challenges, right? The ability to move workloads around, no matter how dynamically, is going to depend on multi-cloud networking. And we're in this really interesting deja vu spot where networking is different on AWS and Azure and Google Cloud. And Oracle is investing, but it's going to be different on Oracle too, right? And it harkens back to the day of, well, I understand iOS, but Junos does it this way, and Nokia SROS does it this way. Different platforms have their own nerd knobs and value adds, right? So I'm not anti-innovation. I think it's totally up to a technology supplier to say, I've got a better way to do something, to set up, RSVP signaling or what have you. But it makes connections harder, both mentally and network connections. So I call out multi-cloud networking as one of a set of key technology areas that we really need to pay attention to, because it's going to be a great equalizing force there. The easier it is for me to move stuff between clouds and my own, private data center for hybrid cloud work. I can then move those workloads from 1 month to the next, and 1 week to the next, and maybe 1 hour to the next. And I can keep, if I have real-time or near real-time information on what resources cost me on different platforms, there's a world where I can optimize very, very well and place workloads where they make sense at a given time. I know that is a lofty goal and doesn't match, many of the operations paradigms that you called out, but it's a strong possibility, and I think it's going to be an enabler.
Yeah, I think that there's going to definitely be some that's going to get taken advantage of, and it's going to become more prevalent in the future. To be honest, going back, I didn't even think, I hated the idea of multi-cloud. I fought against it. I was like, okay, just AWS.
You have my attention. I'm listening.
I could not. I was, because there was a time, like I was actually doing a big refresh with AWS, with colo gear, with a lot of stuff going on. It was kind of right when Transit Gateway came out.
Right.
And, I got a tap on the shoulder, like a literal tap on the shoulder. I was in the office, and it's like, okay, we've got to be in Azure. We have to have it operationalized. We have to have the tenancy structure. We have to have everything built out, circuits and yada, 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 right, in like 4 months. And I was like, what?
Wow.
Like, we're doing this Transit Gateway thing. Why are we going to another cloud?
Right.
Let's stay in the same cloud and just like, that's enough.
Right.
Let's become experts at that. And then, fast forward a year and we were in another additional. So we were 3 clouds deep. And it was because a lot of it was like acquisition based.
Sure.
Or, we had a big line of business that said, hey, we're using this cloud for these reasons. If you don't help us, we're going to do it ourselves.
Right.
And it's kind of something you want to get out in front of, because you're going to have to fix it anyway.
Right.
When they bring it back to you, and they give the same /20 to every single network that they want to connect.
Whoops.
And you have a little bit of overlap times 20,
right.
So yeah, it's the multi-cloud thing, and having we're outside of the walls of our data center now. Like,
right,
services are everywhere.
Yep.
PaaS services, you still need a private network.
Right.
I know that many think that the private network is dead. Firewalls are dead. All this stuff is done.
Right.
And tell me why firewall spend is like, an all-time high.
Right.
You got to follow the money.
Exactly.
And then you see what's important.
Yep.
So yeah, it's an interesting one for sure.
Well, those, the burst use cases too, like when government mandates for agencies to start moving applications to cloud first started coming out, there was a lot of nervousness about, there is no cloud. There's just somebody else's computer, right? That's a bumper sticker. But the first use case that really convinced me was basically NASA serving up imagery, from Mars. And, the old telephone network analogy is Mother's Day, right? That's the busiest day of the year because on Mother's Day, what do? You call your mom. Next question. But you don't want to build a private data center to serve up, those thousands of images that you're getting from Mars for the first time. You want that burst capability. And that's a relatively simple example where, today, well, it might cost me this on AWS, but tomorrow on Google Cloud, it might cost me even less, right? So I should be able to move that burst capability, but I still have my root capability in my private data center. Again, I know it's probably the simplest use case, but that's what got me thinking about this 10 years ago.
Yeah, it isn't interesting because I know I've seen some success cases with this already, and I've seen some not so successful cases. And, I think it, as with most things, I guess, comes down to architecture, design, engineering, because if you're going all completely cloud native, if you're using like the popular Kubernetes clusters of each cloud provider,
right,
it's not so simple being locked into the identity and access management and all the things that go along with that cloud and just taking a workload and moving it.
Right.
But there's a lot of things that can act as an overlay. Like you had, Rancher was huge. So running containers and you could literally move them across cloud if you would want. And then you have a multi-cloud network solution. Like I'll just, Alkira, I work there. It's the same network across all these things. But you have these, and that kind of sort of leads into like another question, I guess, that I have is, nobody, there was this old thing, when I started working in network engineering, nobody gets fired for buying Cisco or buying IBM or buying Oracle, yada, yada, yada. And now there's so much change is happening so fast, and it's out of the wheelhouse of some of these traditional vendors, a lot of startups. So a lot of the companies I, began working for, we basically were handcuffed into using like 3 or 4 vendors.
Right.
Like that was our selection process, unless we acquired another company and they had a different firewall vendor. So what should practitioners keep in mind? Like, is the way that we choose vendors and platforms, like how is that selection going to work in the future? I know it's a challenge.
So it's a room for individuals and companies to step up and help guide folks through that process. You and I have talked about this idea I'm developing called Total Network Operations, TNOPS, because I'm not in marketing, and there are good reasons for me to not be in marketing. But yes, I just made TNOPS up, and I like it. So, but a couple fundamental principles that I'm baking into this.
TNOPS, what does that stand for again?
Total Network Operations.
Okay.
So it decodes pretty well. But thank you for asking for the clarification.
Tell me about it. What is this TNOPS?
So, I see 2 overarching principles. Number one, we view the technologies that we use from an operations perspective in silos. This is my automation stack. This is my visibility stack. This is what's happening with security. These are my collaboration tools. You need to not view them as silos. There need to be permeable osmotic membranes between the silos, and you need to work hard to elevate and look at it as an entire system, operating on the network infrastructure, connected to business requirements. That's what I mean when I say holistic view. That's what I mean. So that's kind of principle number one. Principle number 2 is we're at a time where there's so much technological churn, and that's mostly good with new things coming to market, especially in the AI and AI-enabled space. You can't just react. You've got to invest time to look at new tooling and new tech that's coming out from an operations perspective. Don't just let it get shoved down your throat from the engineering and architecture teams. Operations teams often sit at the lowest rung of the ladder, right? You need to protect yourselves, and you need to go figure out, okay, how can AI really help me here? What does this new automation tooling really do for me? What's going on in multi-cloud networking and so forth? So take a holistic view of your operation stack and be proactive in investigating new technology.
And this total network ops, I mean, you're bringing everything under that umbrella, like even like wireless, wide area network,
Absolutely.
Cloud networking, data center, all the, network is a network.
Correct.
That's a sort of approach.
And again, I'll see you. I'm taking it all in that one umbrella. I'll also raise you. But you zoom out, and you could take a total operations view for just the compute side of things, or just the storage side of things, or how that's all orchestrated together to not deliver just applications but services. So there's a bigger total X operations view that I'm leaving for future work. I'm a network guy, so I'm just focused on total network operations now. But that's a really intriguing problem set, and I think we can reduce entropy with it all.
Yeah, that's a really compelling idea. I like it. It sounds good, rolling off the tongue too. Total network ops, TNOps.
That's excellent validation. Thank you.
Yeah, it sounds good. In stark contrast from some of the stuff that AWS names when they roll out new services, you're like, what were they thinking?
Well, when you're rolling out so many services so quickly,
you run out of names. There's nothing left.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, and kudos to them for that innovation factory. And customer obsession, I believe, is a real thing. They do lots of interesting stuff from that perspective. Of course, they have over 1.5 million employees. Yeah. Amazon total, not just AWS. But
it is really impressive. So the other day, actually, I had on one of my accounts that I use to test and prototype things with VPC limit. You can only create like 6 of them out of the box. And I was like, I need more than that. I need to actually test, and I'm doing these things. And and I'm doing like multi-region. And so I go to this little thing, and it's like, increase the limit. It's like, how many do you want? And I was just like, 60. And it's like, okay, we'll get to this within like, I think it was like 48 hours or something. And I went up and I got some coffee. I came back down, and I was about to do something else, and the page had refreshed, and it was already done.
Yeah.
It was like instant. I'm like, wow, that was really convenient.
Yeah. They set an interesting expectation. That's more like a telco SLA for instantiating new services. But then come back with your hot coffee and you're good to go. So
yeah, it's impressive. Yeah, well, I think we're running up on time. Do you have anything else you'd like to impart to the audience? Any wisdom? We want wisdom.
I would. So I would say this. You've got this is related to imposter syndrome, and hat tip to Chris Grundeman and his Imposter Syndrome Network podcast. You've got things to say, and they might not be for everybody. They might not be for most people. But you're at the point in your life with the experience you have for some reason. Someone might benefit from the things you bring to the table, and don't worry about the haters, right? Or somebody who, may not think that's not for me. You can be a little bolder and a little more relaxed about, hey, I have this idea. I'd like to develop it. That's kind of where I'm coming from with the whole total network ops perspective, right? It might not be for everybody. It might not be useful to a lot of people, but there might be some it's useful for. And okay, let's work together and figure out how to make it more useful.
That's great. I love it. Yeah, well, thanks for coming on. Thanks for doing this in person. It's nice to actually see somebody face to face and drink a little coffee and have a good time, have some good conversation.
Absolutely. So I'm really glad we could do this in person. We've got an event locally tonight with the Virginia Nug kickoff.
Yeah, Virginia
tonight.
Nug.
So woohoo!
Yeah, it'll be fun. By the time this airs, we'll all be talking about it.
Cool.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thanks, William.